Hi poker fans, Harry here, and every region has a champion, from Blue in Kanto to Gita in Paldea. However, one question has always surrounded a champion, and that is, who was the original Kanto champion before Blue? Well, that is what this video is going to answer. But before we get into that, don't forget to subscribe, also leave a like and comment down below, and let's get in to the video. So, of course, the original Kanto champion before Blue is never known. It's one of the questions that never gets answered in Pokemon. And it is also unclear whether there was even an original Kanto champion before Blue. However, it would make Kanto a bit weird and an outlier if it wasn't, because every other region, apart from, like, Alola, but that's... I'll get to that a bit later in this video, has a champion. So it would make Kanto a bit weird. And there is evidence for and against there being an original Kanto champion. So I want to go over all the people that I think it could be. Starting with Lance. Of course, Lance is the final member of the Elite Four, and also the champion in the Johto games. And Lance actually gives our first piece of evidence for there being an original Kanto champion, because he says to the player character that they would be champion if it wasn't for Blue. So, that led many people to think that Lance could have been the original champion, because he says, you beat me, so you would be champion if it wasn't for Blue. And also, he has been referred to as the champion, of course, many times. Of course, he was the champion of Indigo Plateau in the Johto games. And also, Kukui in the Alola games calls Lance the last guy, stating that he was the last one that Kukui would have to defeat to become champion. Kukui eventually lost to Lance, meaning that it wasn't Kukui. But there is a lot of evidence for Lance being the original champion. However, something that throws that into disarray is that Red gives Lance the champion position, throwing into doubt whether Lance was actually good enough to be the champion originally, because he never won the championship back from Red. Red gave it to him when he went off to Mount Silver, meaning that could Lance be the last guy, like, actually the champion? And also, if Lance was the champion, why did he just become the next highest Elite Four member? We've never had that with any other champion where they just go down the rankings, down into the Elite Four. So it would be a bit weird that Lance still gets a high ranking position, like, straight away, because we never hear that the Elite Four is being rearranged. So I don't think it could be Lance. But of course, I just mentioned the Elite Four of the Kanto region, so why not go over the Kanto/Johto Elite Four? So, let's look at the next highest Elite Four member, because why wouldn't it be? Let's take a look at Karen. Well, she is not around, she is not even mentioned in Kanto in any way, shape or form. She almost appears out of nowhere for the Johto games, which it probably would not be her. I think she kind of rose quite quickly to the Elite Four, and I don't think really it would be Karen, as the Dark types come from Johto, which she is a specialist in, so it throws into even more doubt that she was the champion. But now let's talk about another Elite Four member, Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno. He was not only in the Kanto Elite Four, but he was in the Johto Elite Four as well. So he is a two-time Elite Four member. However, he has stayed in the same position, basically, throughout the whole of those two games, those two regions. So I don't think that Bruno was actually good enough to be champion. I think he was just a really good trainer, that he was in the Elite Four for a long time, but I don't think he went to that extra step to become champion. And the same, I think, can be said for, of course, Koga. Koga was obviously a really strong trainer, being the Elite Four member in the Johto games, but when the Kanto games were around, and when the original champion should have been in place as the champion, Koga was a gym leader, meaning it definitely wasn't Koga. And also, there is Will from the Johto Elite Four. However, I don't think he would be around either, unless the Will is Lorelei theory is true. And again, similar thing for Lorelei. Like Bruno, I don't think she would have been good enough to be the original, the original Kanto champion. However, then we get to Agatha, and even though she is below Lance, which with some other evidence would count her out, I don't think it entirely does. However, I think there is someone even stronger than Agatha, someone that could put her in her place. And if you've seen Agatha, that is not easy to do. So I don't think it will be Agatha, but just keep that in your mind. But of course, Kanto isn't the only region filled with strong trainers. So let's take a look at some of the champions from other regions, starting with Stephen and Wallace from Hoenn. So Stephen and Wallace are, of course, really strong trainers, being champions of Hoenn through Ruby Sapphire and Emerald and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. However, something that counts them out almost immediately is that the Hoenn games take place at the exact same time as the events of the Kanto games. So Stephen and Wallace would be too busy being the champion of Hoenn, and if you're thinking, oh well, it could be one instead of the other, let's take a look at it. So Stephen is the champion in 4 games, being Ruby Sapphire and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. So he is too busy being the champion of those games. And yes, then Wallace becomes champion in Emerald, meaning that Wallace would be too busy for the events of Emerald. However, Wallace would already be too busy in the Ruby Sapphire and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire timeline because he is the 8th and final gym leader, meaning that he is too busy with that. And then you could be thinking, well, what about Stephen? Well, Stephen is tied up pretty quickly with Devon Corp and all that, because you can see just in the games that he is champion, he is in Devon Corp a lot and has a lot to do. So I think he would be too busy either being the Hoenn champion or with Devon Corp, his own basically business. And I think similar things for Wallace, he'd be too busy being champion or the 8th gym leader. But of course, as I said, that isn't the only champions. Now let's move on to probably the most powerful champion out there. Cynthia, the champion of Sinnoh. And I think I have to count her out pretty quickly as well. Because when the player character eventually becomes champion, Professor Rowan turns up and Cynthia says to Professor Rowan that last time that her and Rowan were in the Hall of Fame was a long time ago, as it was when Cynthia first became champion, meaning that she has held that position for a long time. Meaning that Cynthia was probably champion of the Sinnoh region, but, well, when the original Kanto champion was champion of the Kanto region. Meaning, I don't think it's Cynthia either. And then I think after Gen 5, the champions get scarcer and scarcer, because there is a long gap in between the events of the Gen 2 and 4 games and the Gens 5 games and onwards, because there is like a 13 or something year time jump, meaning that definitely Iris, Hop, How, Nimona, and maybe even Leon and Geeta would be too young to be champions of, well, the original champions of the Kanto region. So I think that they might have to be counted out. However, I did mention a person earlier, Kukui. Kukui is the kind of title defense champion for the Alola games. And he says that once he travelled through Kanto and defeated all their gym leaders. However, he is counted out immediately because he couldn't beat Lance. And if I think Lance was the final Elite Four member back in the day, not the champion, then Kukui definitely wasn't the champion. And also, How is just counted out immediately one, he's too young, and two, we see him receive his first ever Pokemon in the Alola games, so he's counted out. Same thing again for Nemona and Iris, and maybe even Leon and Geeta. I don't want to count Alda and Diantha out just yet, but they are weak source champions, really. Diantha is easily regarded as the easiest champion, and Alda doesn't even lose to the player character. He loses to N, meaning that the champion battle in Black and White isn't even against the champion, it is against N, meaning I don't think it could be those two either. But with all the champions catered out, where does that leave us? Well, I do want to mention two gym leaders. Two of the strongest gym leaders being Giovanni and Claire. Again, Giovanni from Kanto, Claire from Johto. And they are really strong. I mean, they said that they can rival the Elite Four in power. However, they can just rival it. I think Giovanni, maybe if he tried really hard, could push and become champion. However, he is the leader of a criminal enterprise, and his crew sneak around and pull off illegal activities, obviously. So I think having him as champion puts too much spotlight on him, because as gym leader, he can kind of do what he wants mostly without being detected. However, I think as champion, it would just put his illegal activities out there and he'd be in prison. And Claire cannot beat her cousin Lance. It has been stated in the Dragon's Den that she is scared of Lance's authority and that she hasn't been able to beat him. So I don't think it's Claire either. But then again, as I said, where does that leave us? Well, there are even stronger trainers than champions, with one of those being Pyramid King Brandon. Now, Pyramid King Brandon is the leader and the, hardest member of the Battle Frontier from the Hoenn games. And of course, anyone that has tried the Battle Frontier, those battle facilities, will tell you just how hard it is just to get bronze in symbols. It is so hard, and Brandon is the hardest in that facility. And I think he would be too busy with the Battle Frontier, because as I said with Steven and Wallace, the Kanto and Hoenn games take place at the same time. So I think he would just be too busy with the Battle Frontier. However, that doesn't count us out for battle facility leaders, because I want to talk about the leader of the battle tower in Sinnoh, Palmer. Of course, Palmer, again, is a strong trainer, and it is just really hard to beat him at all. And I think that, unfortunately, it isn't Palmer either, because his family lives in Sinnoh, and he seems like he at least wants to spend some time with his family, with Barry, your rival in Sinnoh, not seeming to hold any anonymity when it comes towards his dad Palmer when we eventually meet him. So I think if Palmer was living in another region, never seeing his family, there would be a bit more tension between them. But that doesn't seem the case. So I don't think it's Palmer either. But where does that leave us then? Well, I think it becomes quite clear when there are two things that I mentioned earlier this video that I haven't made sense of yet. So one is the Sinnoh champion, Cynthia. Because in the Hall of Fame, only champions are allowed. Like when you become champion in Hoenn, May and Professor Birch aren't allowed in. And when you become champion in Johto, Mary from Pokemon Talk isn't allowed in. So only champions are allowed in to the Hall of Fame. And in Sinnoh, Professor Rowan is allowed in the Hall of Fame. And one of his closest associates that he learned most with is Professor Oak, the Pokemon professor of Kanto. So, Is it Professor Oak? Well, as I mentioned before, the one person that I think could put Agatha in her place is Professor Oak. They once had a relationship, and I think Oak, with his knowledge of Pokemon, was actually a better battler than her, despite him later becoming a Pokemon professor, with her being an Elite Four trainer. But I think it was Professor Oak, and there are several pieces of evidence to support this. Like, at the start of the Kanto games, Professor Oak has an email from the Pokemon League, with them wanting him to visit the League. And also, maybe battling runs in the family, or Professor Oak taught his grandson Blue how to battle, because of course Blue becomes the champion of the Kanto region, so maybe he learnt from his granddad, Professor Oak. And also, as with Professor Rowan, when the player character beats Blue and becomes champion, Professor Oak walks the player character into the Hall of Fame, which, as I stated before, only champions are allowed into. However, the biggest piece of evidence comes in the form of data for a never-used battle, which has Professor Oak having a team of 6 Pokemon with levels slightly higher than Champion Blue. So I think you would have beat Blue, and then your final battle to truly become the true champion of Pokemon would have been Professor Oak. I think with all of these, the email from the Pokemon League, the fact that his grandson could become champion, the fact that he is allowed in the Hall of Fame, and the data for a team of 6 of his, I think means that Professor Oak was the original Kanto champion. But that's just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of this fairy. Do you think Professor Oak was the original champion? If not, who do you think it was? Do you think there was even an original Kanto champion before Blue? And of course, if you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, also subscribe, and share it out. And I will see you in the next one.